Introduction. There is a strange possibility. What if the greatest obstacle in your life is not your lack of talent, not your circumstances, not your past, not even the people around you? What if the real obstacle is something so familiar that you've never thought to question it? Take a moment and consider this. Every day, millions of people wake up believing they are making independent choices. They choose careers, relationships, dreams, opinions, beliefs. They assume they are steering their own lives. But what if much of that steering has already been decided long before they became aware of it? What if invisible patterns inherited from family, culture, education, habit, fear, and repetition have quietly become the architects of an entire lifetime? The most powerful prisons are rarely built from concrete and steel. They are built from unquestioned assumptions. And unlike ordinary prisons, their doors are left wide open. People remain inside because they cannot see the walls. Perhaps you've experienced it yourself. You work harder than ever, yet fulfillment keeps moving farther away. You achieve goals that once seemed impossible, only to discover a strange emptiness waiting on the other side. You scroll endlessly through information, searching for clarity, yet your mind becomes noisier instead of calmer. You feel surrounded by endless opportunities while secretly wondering why life still feels constrained. Modern life has given us extraordinary technology, instant communication, unlimited information, powerful tools. Yet anxiety continues to rise. Burnout has become ordinary. Comparison has become constant. Many people are more connected than ever before, and lonelier than ever before. Something beneath the surface isn't working. But what? Most people search for the answer in the wrong direction. They change jobs, cities, relationships, productivity systems, morning routines, financial strategies. They renovate the exterior while leaving the hidden architecture untouched. It is like repainting a house whose foundation is quietly cracking beneath the ground. The color changes. The instability remains. This book is not about positive thinking. It is not about blind optimism. It is not another collection of motivational slogans promising overnight transformation. Instead, it is an investigation. An expedition into one of the least explored territories of human experience. The invisible machinery of thought itself. Throughout these pages, we will uncover why outdated beliefs continue controlling modern lives. Why familiar suffering often feels safer than unfamiliar freedom. Why entire communities can become accustomed to conditions that quietly steal their vitality. Why borrowed answers eventually stop solving living problems. And perhaps most importantly, why genuine transformation has less to do with changing your circumstances than changing the lens through which you see them. But be warned. This is not a book to read casually. Because some ideas, once understood, cannot be forgotten. Some questions refuse to leave the mind. Some truths quietly rearrange the way you experience the world forever. As you continue, you may begin noticing patterns that were always present but somehow remained invisible. You may recognize habits you never consciously chose. Stories you inherited without examination. Fears disguised as wisdom. Comfort disguised as certainty. And traditions that quietly became limitations. At first, these discoveries may feel unsettling. That is natural. Every meaningful awakening begins with the realization that what once felt permanent was only familiar. But there is another side to this journey. Every illusion that dissolves creates space for something greater. Every outdated belief that falls makes room for clearer vision. Every invisible chain that breaks returns a little more of your freedom. You will notice that this book does not rush toward conclusions. That is intentional. Life rarely reveals its deepest truths all at once. The universe unfolds them in layers. Like walking through a dense forest before sunrise. At first you see only shadows. Then outlines. Then colors. Eventually, an entirely new landscape appears not because the forest changed, but because your eyes did. That is exactly how this journey has been designed. Each chapter reveals one piece of a much larger puzzle. Every insight prepares you for the next. Each answer uncovers a deeper question. Not to confuse you, but to awaken a way of seeing that cannot be handed to you by anyone else. By the final page, you may discover that the greatest transformation was never waiting somewhere outside your life. It was waiting inside your perception. Because the future does not belong to those who simply inherit the world. It belongs to those who learn to see it with fresh eyes. So before we begin, I invite you to make only one promise. Do not believe anything simply because it is written here. Question it. Challenge it. Test it against your own experience. If an idea proves true, let it become yours. If it does not, leave it behind without hesitation. This is not a book asking for followers. It is an invitation to become an explorer. And every expedition begins the same way. Not with certainty, but with a single courageous question. What if everything I have assumed about change is only the first layer of a much deeper story? Turn the page. The first mystery is already waiting. Chapter 1. The House That Refused to Fall. Some structures do not collapse when they die. They remain standing. Silent. Familiar. Untouched. And because they remain standing, everyone quietly agrees to pretend they are still alive. That is where every great human tragedy begins. Imagine arriving in an old coastal town where time seems to have stopped decades ago. At its center stands a magnificent stone sanctuary. Long ago it was the heartbeat of the community. Weddings echoed beneath its ceiling. Children laughed across its courtyard. People entered carrying burdens and left carrying hope. Now no voices remain. The windows are cracked. The roof bends under its own exhaustion. The walls lean just enough to make every passing stranger glance upward with quiet fear. No one enters anymore. Even the birds seem to circle around it rather than land upon it. Whenever heavy winds arrive, people pause whatever they are doing. This might be the night, they whisper. When thunder rolls across the sky, curtains move aside as neighbors look toward the old building. Has it finally fallen? Lightning flashes. Nothing changes. The sanctuary still stands. Dead, but standing. That image contains one of the deepest truths about human life. Death is not always dangerous. Sometimes what refuses to die is far more destructive. A fallen tree slowly becomes fertile soil. An extinguished fire leaves room for fresh forests. Winter eventually releases spring. Nature understands something we constantly resist. What has completed its purpose must be allowed to disappear. Human beings often choose the opposite. We preserve exhausted ideas. We defend broken systems. We protect identities that no longer fit the people we've become. And then we wonder why life feels so heavy. Perhaps the greatest burden is not carrying something new. It is dragging something old that quietly stopped serving us years ago. But here is the strange part. Most people never notice the weight they are carrying. Not because it is light. Because they have carried it for so long that it feels like part of their own body. That single realization changes everything. The Committee of Comfort. Eventually, the caretakers responsible for the abandoned sanctuary gathered to solve the problem. Curiously, they refused to meet inside the building. Even they feared it might collapse. So they assembled at a safe distance. They spoke with serious expressions. Long discussions followed. Thoughtful speeches were delivered. At last, they proudly announced 4 decisions. The first was obvious. The old sanctuary must eventually be removed. Everyone nodded. The second sounded inspiring. A beautiful new sanctuary should rise in its place. Again, unanimous agreement. The third decision felt comforting. The old stones should be reused. The old doors should remain. The old foundation should stay. The new sanctuary should preserve everything from the old one. No one questioned the contradiction. Then came the fourth decision. The old sanctuary must remain standing until the new one is completely finished. Silence filled the meeting. It sounded reasonable, responsible, practical. Yet hidden inside those words was a quiet impossibility. The new sanctuary could never begin because the old one still occupied the ground where it needed to exist. The meeting ended with applause. Nothing changed. Years passed. The building continued waiting for a collapse everyone expected but nobody permitted. How often do we conduct the same meeting inside our own minds? We tell ourselves, I want a different life. I want peace. I want healthier relationships. I want courage. But then another voice quietly insists, nothing essential must change. Keep the same fears. Keep the same habits. Keep the same stories. Keep the same emotional architecture. Simply paint the walls. Call it transformation. That is not renewal. It is restoration of decay. And decay cannot become life simply because we rename it. Yet this is where the story becomes truly interesting. The same invisible meeting is happening far beyond individual lives. It quietly shapes families, organizations, entire cultures, and perhaps even civilizations. When age becomes an idol, many societies proudly celebrate how ancient their traditions are. History certainly deserves gratitude. Roots matter. Memory matters. Wisdom matters. But age alone is never proof of truth. An old map may be beautiful. It still cannot guide travelers through roads that no longer exist. A software program written decades ago cannot safely operate today's world without change. Even the stars we admire evolve. Everything alive renews itself. The universe never repeats yesterday exactly. Only what has stopped living refuses to change. There is enormous beauty in honoring the past. There is enormous danger in worshipping it. These are not the same thing. A living culture resembles a river. Its identity remains. Its water never does. The moment the water stops moving, it ceases to be a river. It becomes something entirely different. Human beings often make the same mistake with themselves. We become loyal to earlier versions of who we were. The ambitious student. The wounded child. The successful executive. The disappointed partner. The fearful dreamer. Those identities once protected us. Eventually they became walls. And walls rarely announce the moment they become prisons. Few people realize this while it is happening. They simply notice that joy gradually becomes harder to find. Wonder quietly disappears. Conversations grow repetitive. Dreams shrink until survival feels ambitious enough. Something essential fades. Yet nobody knows exactly when. The comfort of familiar pain. There is another mystery hidden beneath this one. Why do intelligent people remain inside situations that clearly make them unhappy? Why does a burnout professional continue chasing promotions that no longer satisfy them? Why does someone stay trapped inside relationships built on emotional distance? Why do communities normalize problems that would shock an outsider? The answer is surprisingly uncomfortable. Human beings adapt astonishingly well. Even to suffering. Especially to suffering. At first, discomfort feels unbearable. Later, it becomes routine. Eventually, it becomes identity. That progression happens so slowly that we mistake adaptation for reality. What once felt unacceptable begins to feel ordinary. And ordinary eventually feels permanent. This is not resilience. It is unconscious accommodation. There is an important difference. Resilience heals. Accommodation forgets healing was ever possible. The distinction may seem subtle. Its consequences shape entire lives. But before we can understand why this happens, we must examine something even stranger. Our senses themselves can be trained to mistake poison for perfume. The nose that forgot the wind. Picture a traveler who has spent decades working on fishing boats. Every sunrise begins with salt water. Every evening ends with nets. The scent of fish has become inseparable from the idea of home. One afternoon, curiosity leads him into an elegant district filled with artisan fragrance studios. As soon as he steps inside, waves of jasmine, cedarwood, citrus blossoms, and rare spices drift through the air. He freezes. His face tightens. He covers his nose. "What an unbearable smell!" he mutters. The deeper he walks, the stronger the fragrances become. His breathing grows shallow. His heartbeat accelerates. Soon dizziness overwhelms him. He collapses onto the polished stone floor. The perfumers rush toward him. Surely expensive fragrances will revive him. One bottle after another is opened. Lavender, rose, amber, sandalwood. Each fragrance makes him struggle even more. The crowd grows confused. How can something so beautiful create such distress? Then another fisherman pushes through the gathering. He understands immediately. "No more perfume," he says. "You're making it worse." He searches for the traveler's worn fishing bag. It still carries the familiar scent of the sea. He sprinkles a few drops of water across the old canvas and gently places it beside the unconscious man's face. The traveler inhales deeply. Relief floods his body. A smile appears. "There," he whispers. "Now that smells right." Everyone else looks at one another in disbelief. What rescued him was precisely what everyone else considered unpleasant. The problem was never his nose. It was his conditioning. And perhaps ours. This story is not about fragrance. It is about familiarity. We often confuse familiar with healthy, predictable with safe, inherited with true, repeated with necessary. The mind slowly learns to call its oldest prison home. That hidden habit shapes far more of life than most people ever imagine. The explanations that protect our sleep. Whenever a society faces painful realities, it has two choices. It can transform them, or it can explain them. Transformation demands courage. Explanations require only imagination. So explanations multiply. If someone struggles, we search for reasons that relieve us of responsibility. If injustice appears, we quickly create comforting stories. If suffering continues long enough, we eventually stop seeing it altogether. Explanation becomes anesthesia. Not because it removes pain, because it removes urgency. That may be the most dangerous comfort of all. For every explanation that protects our conscience quietly postpones the moment when change becomes possible. That is where our journey truly begins. Because before a new foundation can be laid, we must first discover why we have been so determined to keep rebuilding the same invisible ruins. Chapter 2. The Invisible Web. There is a comforting illusion that most people carry without ever noticing it. We believe that our lives belong only to us. Our victories are ours. Our failures are ours. Our suffering is ours. Our success is ours. The story seems simple. Until one unexpected moment reveals that nothing has ever been simple. Life is woven together far more intricately than we imagine. Every choice sends invisible ripples through people we may never meet. Every silence shapes conversations we never hear. Every act of courage or every act of fear travels farther than our eyes can follow. Most people spend their lives believing they are isolated islands. The truth is far stranger. We are currents in the same ocean. And when one current changes direction, countless others are quietly carried with it. That realization is uncomfortable, because it also means something else. The explanations we have inherited about suffering may not be telling the whole story. And once that possibility enters the mind, it becomes impossible to look at the world in quite the same way again. The falling bell. Many years ago, an old wanderer walked peacefully through a quiet town. He was in no hurry. The afternoon sun painted long shadows across the stone streets, and the only sound was the distant ringing of a bell high above an ancient tower. Then, in a single instant, everything changed. A worker repairing the tower lost his footing. He fell. The wanderer never saw him coming. The worker landed directly upon him. The worker escaped with little more than bruises. The wanderer, however, suffered a severe injury that would keep him confined for months. When news spread, many of his students rushed to visit him. They expected sorrow. Perhaps anger. Perhaps questions directed toward the universe. Instead, they found him quietly smiling. One student finally asked, "What lesson could possibly exist inside something so unfair?" The old traveler remained silent for several moments. Then he answered softly, "I discovered that reality is more connected than our explanations allow." Everyone leaned closer. He continued, "Notice what happened. I did not climb the tower. I did not lose my balance. I did not fall. Yet I carried the consequences of another person's mistake." He paused again. "And that means something profound. The world is not built from separate stories. It is built from shared consequences." Those words settled into the room like evening light. Most people imagine life as a collection of private journeys. But the universe rarely works that way. A distracted driver changes an entire family forever. One compassionate teacher awakens confidence in hundreds of children. A stranger's kindness prevents someone from giving up. A careless rumor destroys years of trust. Invisible threads connect everything. What touches one life often reaches another. Sometimes immediately. Sometimes decades later. That hidden network explains far more than we realize. Yet this raises a difficult question. If lives are deeply interconnected, why do we spend so much energy pretending every outcome belongs only to the individual? The answer hides inside one of humanity's oldest habits. Our love of simple explanations. Stories that free us from responsibility. The human mind dislikes uncertainty. When something painful happens, it immediately searches for a reason. Not necessarily the true reason. The fastest one. The explanation becomes a shield. A conclusion arrives. The mind relaxes. The investigation ends. But certainty is not always wisdom. Sometimes it is simply the point where curiosity dies. Whenever suffering appears, there is enormous comfort in believing that someone else entirely deserves it. If a person struggles financially, if another feels abandoned, if someone lives with illness, if another loses hope, it becomes emotionally convenient to imagine that the explanation begins and ends with that individual. The rest of us remain untouched. Our conscience remains comfortable. No difficult questions need to be asked. No uncomfortable changes become necessary. Responsibility quietly disappears. Yet life repeatedly tells a different story. A child does not choose the neighborhood where they are born. A teenager does not create the emotional climate of an entire household. An exhausted employee rarely controls the culture of an organization. Many of the forces shaping our lives were already moving long before we arrived. This does not remove personal responsibility. It enlarges it. Because once we understand connection, responsibility no longer ends at our own doorstep. It expands. Quietly. Relentlessly. Beautifully. And perhaps that is the deeper invitation. Not to ask, "Whose fault is this?" but, "What part of this web am I helping create?" That single shift changes everything. The hospital of familiar thinking. Imagine walking into a vast hospital unlike any ever built. The patients wear ordinary clothes. They laugh. They work. They argue. They celebrate. From the outside, everything appears normal. Only gradually do you notice something unusual. Almost everyone has accepted conditions that should never have been accepted. They no longer question constant anxiety. They call exhaustion ambition. They call loneliness independence. They call emotional numbness maturity. They call endless comparison motivation. They have become experts at surviving. Very few remember how to live. One visitor begins asking uncomfortable questions. Why is everyone so tired? The patients shrug. That's life. Why is everyone afraid of slowing down? That's normal. Why does everyone feel disconnected? Everyone feels that way. The visitor grows increasingly puzzled. The answers sound less like truth and more like repetition. Perhaps the greatest danger is not pain itself. Perhaps it is becoming so familiar with pain that imagination can no longer picture its absence. Because once suffering feels ordinary, healing begins to look unrealistic. And that is where transformation quietly stops. Yet something even stranger happens after long periods of unconscious acceptance. People begin protecting the very systems that exhaust them. Why? The answer hides inside the oldest instinct of the human brain. Familiarity feels safer than freedom. The labels we wear. Imagine entering a gathering where every guest wears a different colored mask. Each mask represents a role, a profession, a belief, a background, a status. Soon the guests become so absorbed in protecting their masks that they forget their own faces. Arguments erupt. Not because people truly know one another, but because masks are colliding. Hours pass. Then the lights suddenly fail. Darkness fills the room. Without seeing colors or symbols, conversations begin again. Voices soften. People laugh. Stories emerge. Someone speaks about losing a parent. Another confesses fear of failure. Someone else dreams of creating something meaningful before life ends. Without their masks, something extraordinary happens. They recognize each other. Not as categories. Not as labels. Simply as human beings carrying invisible hopes and invisible wounds. Perhaps identity was never the problem. Attachment to identity was. Whenever a label becomes more important than a living person, wisdom quietly leaves the room. History has repeated this lesson in countless forms. Yet every generation believes it is encountering it for the first time. But before we can understand why labels become so powerful, we must investigate an even older force. Authority. Because whenever people stop asking questions, someone else eventually begins answering them on their behalf. Borrowed certainty. There comes a moment in nearly every civilization when people begin believing that all meaningful discoveries have already been made. The maps are complete. The answers are final. The conversations are over. Nothing truly new remains to explore. It sounds reassuring. It is also the beginning of intellectual sleep. A curious child asks, "Why?" An awakened mind asks, "What if?" A stagnant mind says, "Do not ask." The difference between those three voices determines the future of entire generations. Every remarkable breakthrough in human history began with someone who quietly doubted what everyone else considered obvious. Not because they rejected the past. Because they respected truth more than tradition. Tradition preserves wisdom. Questioning keeps wisdom alive. Without questioning, wisdom slowly transforms into memory. And memory, left untouched long enough, eventually hardens into unquestionable certainty. That certainty feels comforting. Yet comfort has never been the birthplace of discovery. Every explorer leaves familiar shores. Every inventor questions accepted limitations. Every artist paints beyond inherited patterns. Every meaningful life eventually reaches a crossroads where borrowed answers become too small. Perhaps you have already arrived there. Perhaps that quiet restlessness you've been feeling is not confusion at all. Perhaps it is the first sign that your deeper intelligence has begun waking up. And if that is true, the next question becomes impossible to avoid. If inherited answers are incomplete, how do we learn to see with our own eyes without becoming lost? That question opens the next door of our journey. Behind it waits a discovery that changes not only how we think, but how we experience reality itself. Chapter 3. The Map That Could Not Find Tomorrow. There is a moment in every life when an old answer quietly stops working. Most people do not notice it immediately. They simply repeat what has always worked before. They use yesterday's language to solve today's questions. They reach for familiar tools while standing inside an unfamiliar world. And then they wonder why nothing changes. The greatest danger is not having no answers. The greatest danger is believing that yesterday's answers are guaranteed to solve tomorrow's problems. That belief has silently shaped countless lives. And perhaps it has shaped yours. But before we understand why, we must examine a story that reveals something extraordinary about the human mind. Not because of the characters in it, but because, in one way or another, every one of us has become one of them. The apprentice who trusted memory. Long ago, a traveling craftsman became famous for solving unusual problems with remarkable simplicity. Among the many stories told about him, one became especially popular. People loved repeating it because it sounded clever. Over time, children learned it. Parents repeated it. Teachers smiled while telling it. Eventually, the story became less of a lesson and more of a formula. Years passed. The craftsman grew old, and his apprentice inherited both his workshop and his reputation. The apprentice believed he possessed an enormous advantage. My teacher has already shown me the answers. Why think? Why observe? Why explore? Everything important had already been demonstrated. One afternoon, while crossing a dense forest on the way to a distant marketplace, he encountered a familiar challenge. At first, he smiled. I've seen this before. Confidence filled him. He remembered every detail of the old story. Every movement. Every step. Every solution. Without hesitation, he repeated the exact same actions his teacher had once described. Then something unexpected happened. Nothing. The situation refused to cooperate. He repeated the steps more carefully. Still nothing. His confidence slowly turned into confusion. How could the perfect solution suddenly become useless? What he failed to understand was beautifully simple. The world had continued learning, while he had only continued remembering. That single distinction separated wisdom from imitation. And it separates them still. Life never repeats its examinations. Many people imagine life as a school that asks the same questions again and again. It doesn't. Every morning arrives carrying circumstances that have never existed before. Technology changes. Relationships evolve. Markets shift. Families grow. Cultures transform. Even your own mind is not exactly the same one that fell asleep last night. Every sunrise introduces a world that has never existed until that precise moment. Yet our minds desperately search for old scripts. We ask, what worked before? Instead of, what does this moment require? Those questions sound similar. They lead to entirely different futures. Imagine a sailor attempting to cross an ocean using last year's weather report. Imagine an architect designing a bridge while ignoring the landscape beneath it. Imagine a doctor prescribing identical treatment to every patient without listening to their symptoms. We immediately recognize the absurdity. Yet we often manage our own lives exactly this way. We borrow conclusions instead of cultivating perception. We memorize methods instead of developing understanding. We collect answers instead of strengthening awareness. That approach feels efficient. Until reality changes. Reality always changes. And when it does, memorized answers become surprisingly fragile. Yet this is only the surface of the mystery. The deeper problem is not that old solutions become outdated. It is that dependence itself slowly weakens our ability to think. Borrowed eyes. There is a subtle difference between learning from wisdom and living inside someone else's vision. The first expands you. The second replaces you. Imagine a young photographer receiving the camera of a legendary artist. The mentor shares techniques, principles, and years of experience. All of it is valuable. But something essential remains impossible to transfer. The mentor's eyes. The camera can be inherited. The seeing cannot. If the student spends an entire lifetime asking, "How would my teacher photograph this?" they may create accurate copies. They will never create original vision. Life asks each generation to see with fresh eyes. Not because the past lacks value, but because reality refuses to remain still. Every great explorer honored those who came before. None of them walked backward. That is why genuine wisdom never asks for imitation. It asks for awakening. The greatest teachers point toward reality. They never ask to replace it. Yet throughout history, something curious has happened. People gradually became more devoted to preserving answers than developing insight. Books became substitutes for observation. Quotations replaced curiosity. Memory replaced intelligence. And when that happens, something precious quietly disappears. Creative thought. The difference between memory and intelligence. Memory stores. Intelligence discovers. Memory repeats. Intelligence responds. Memory is a library. Intelligence is a living conversation. Both are valuable. Only one remains alive. Picture two musicians standing before the same piano. The first has memorized every famous composition ever written. The second understands music itself. Unexpectedly, one piano key breaks. The first musician freezes. The score no longer matches reality. The second smiles. A new melody begins to emerge. The difference was never talent. It was flexibility. One depended upon memory. The other trusted awareness. Life rarely rewards the person carrying the largest collection of ready-made answers. More often, it rewards the one willing to remain deeply present. Because presence notices what memory cannot. Presence adapts. Presence invents. Presence listens. And listening has become one of the rarest human abilities. We are often so busy searching for familiar conclusions that we never truly hear the question life is asking. That hidden habit costs far more than success. It quietly limits possibility itself. The comfort of ready-made answers. There is undeniable comfort in believing someone else has already solved every important problem. No uncertainty. No risk. No responsibility. Only obedience. For a while, this feels safe. Until life asks a question that has never been asked before. Then borrowed certainty becomes surprisingly fragile. Think about your own life. No book has lived your childhood. No philosopher has experienced your exact relationships. No mentor has walked through your particular fears. Others can illuminate the path. Only you can take the next step. The universe seems to delight in presenting each person with situations no manual fully explains. Not as punishment. As invitation. Because every genuine solution strengthens something far more valuable than the solution itself. It strengthens the mind capable of creating the next one. That is why the goal of wisdom has never been collecting conclusions. The goal has always been cultivating perception. One grows heavier. The other grows freer. The workshop of living minds. Imagine entering two workshops. The first is filled with beautiful old tools displayed behind glass. Visitors admire them, photograph them, protect them from dust. Nothing is ever built there. The second workshop contains fewer tools. Some are worn. Some are unfinished. Some were invented only yesterday. The room is noisy. Experiments fail. Ideas change. People question one another constantly. Mistakes happen. So do discoveries. Which workshop creates the future? The answer is obvious. Yet many people unknowingly build the first workshop inside their own minds. They become caretakers of inherited conclusions rather than creators of living understanding. A living mind does not reject the past. It simply refuses to become imprisoned by it. It asks, what remains true? What must evolve? What have we not yet seen? Those questions keep intelligence alive. Without them, knowledge slowly hardens into habit. Habit quietly becomes limitation. And limitation eventually disguises itself as certainty. Few prisons are stronger than those whose walls cannot be seen. The question that cannot be borrowed. Perhaps this chapter has not really been about stories, or memory, or tradition. Perhaps it has been asking something far more personal. When was the last time you looked directly at your own life, instead of through someone else's conclusions? That question may feel uncomfortable. Good. Growth rarely begins inside comfort. It begins at the edge of honest observation. Because the future does not belong to those who possess the greatest collection of inherited answers. It belongs to those who remain awake enough to ask living questions. And yet, even questioning is not enough. A person may question endlessly and still remain trapped by something far more subtle. An invisible force that quietly shapes every decision before conscious thought even begins. Most people never notice it. But once you do, you will never experience your own mind in quite the same way again. That is the mystery waiting beyond the next chapter. Chapter 4. The Cost of Borrowed Answers. There is a quiet danger hidden inside certainty. Not the certainty born from experience. The certainty inherited without investigation. It speaks with confidence. It quotes respected voices. It repeats familiar conclusions. Yet when reality asks a new question, it suddenly falls silent. Most people mistake memorization for wisdom. But wisdom has never lived inside memorized sentences. Wisdom lives in the ability to meet this moment as it truly is. That difference seems small. It changes everything. Because life never asks yesterday's examination twice. And those who insist on answering every new challenge with an old script eventually discover that reality has stopped listening. But before we understand why this happens, consider a story that reveals how easily intelligence can disappear beneath obedience. The scholar who forgot how to listen. A renowned philosopher was invited to welcome an influential visitor arriving in a prosperous city. The organizers admired the philosopher's reputation, but they also feared his unpredictability. He speaks from the heart, one organizer whispered. That is exactly the problem, another replied. What if he says something unexpected? After a long discussion, they prepared him carefully. If our guest asks about your life, they instructed, give this answer. If he asks about your work, say these exact words. If he asks anything else, simply remain within the script. The philosopher smiled. If it makes everyone comfortable, he said gently, I will do exactly that. For hours he rehearsed. Every response became automatic. Every sentence perfectly memorized. The great day finally arrived. The distinguished visitor entered. The crowd applauded. The philosopher stepped forward. Everything depended on a few simple questions. But something unexpected happened. The visitor forgot the prepared sequence. Instead of asking the first rehearsed question, he asked the second. Without hesitation, the philosopher delivered the answer intended for the first. The visitor looked puzzled. Trying to recover, he asked the first question. Again, without thinking, the philosopher delivered the second answer. Silence filled the room. Finally, the visitor laughed. "My friend," he said, "either I have become terribly confused, or something unusual is happening here." The philosopher laughed even louder. "No," he replied. "We are both trapped. You are asking memorized questions. I am giving memorized answers. Neither of us is actually having a conversation." The audience laughed. Yet beneath the laughter hid an uncomfortable truth. How many conversations in our own lives are nothing more than rehearsed performances? How many opinions have we repeated so often that we mistake them for our own? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all: how many decisions are we making without ever truly thinking? The echo chamber of the mind. Imagine entering a magnificent hall built entirely from polished stone. You speak a single sentence. Immediately the walls return your own voice. Again. And again. And again. Soon you begin believing that many voices agree with you. In reality, you are only hearing yourself. This is how inherited thinking quietly operates. We absorb ideas from childhood. We repeat them through adulthood. Friends reinforce them. Communities celebrate them. Algorithms reward them. Gradually the echo becomes so constant that we mistake familiarity for truth. Yet truth does not become stronger because it is repeated. Nor does repetition transform an assumption into wisdom. Living intelligence requires something far rarer: the courage to interrupt the echo. To ask, "What if this belief is incomplete?" That question is uncomfortable. It is also the birthplace of every genuine breakthrough. Because growth begins precisely where certainty becomes curious. Progress is not betrayal. Many people fear that questioning old ideas means rejecting everything that came before. Nothing could be further from the truth. A skilled architect does not dishonor an old bridge by building a stronger one. A physician does not disrespect earlier discoveries by finding better treatments. A musician does not insult yesterday's masterpieces by composing new symphonies. Every meaningful advancement is an act of gratitude. It says, "What came before carried us this far. Now it is our responsibility to carry the journey farther." Living traditions evolve. Only abandoned traditions remain frozen. The universe itself demonstrates this rhythm everywhere. Forests regenerate. Stars transform. Cells replace themselves. Even the human brain rewires throughout life. Nothing alive remains exactly as it was. Why should understanding be different? The moment we expect wisdom to stop growing, we quietly declare that reality has finished teaching us. Reality has never made such a promise. The difference between tools and thinking. Consider a master craftsperson entering a workshop. The room contains extraordinary instruments collected across generations. Each tool carries history. Each one solved important problems. But the craftsperson understands something essential. No tool is sacred. Every tool exists to serve the work. If a new challenge appears, a new instrument may need to be invented. The true genius never worships the hammer. The genius learns how to build. Many people reverse this relationship. They become devoted to methods instead of outcomes, to formulas instead of understanding, to instructions instead of observation. Eventually they stop solving problems. They merely repeat procedures. That shift is subtle. Yet it explains why some individuals continue growing throughout life while others become prisoners of yesterday's certainty. One group carries answers. The other develops the capacity to discover them. The second group will always remain freer. Because life never runs out of new questions. wearing the future like a costume. There is another illusion that quietly shapes modern life. We often mistake appearance for transformation. New devices, new fashions, new vocabulary, new buildings. Everything looks modern. Yet beneath the surface, ancient fears continue directing every decision. A person may work inside the world's most advanced laboratory while still allowing superstition to make their most important choices. Someone may lead an innovative company while refusing to examine inherited emotional patterns. Another may proudly celebrate progress while secretly fearing every unfamiliar idea. The exterior evolves. The interior remains untouched. It is like installing the newest navigation system into a ship whose captain still refuses to leave the harbor. Technology can expand possibility. Only consciousness can decide how possibility is used. That distinction matters more than most people realize. History has repeatedly shown that sophisticated tools in the hands of outdated thinking rarely create lasting progress. Real transformation always begins deeper than appearances. It begins with perception. Curiosity, humanity's greatest technology. What is the most powerful invention ever created? Many would point toward remarkable machines. Others might mention revolutionary discoveries. Yet every one of those achievements began with something invisible. A question. Someone looked at reality and quietly asked, "What if there is another way?" Every extraordinary breakthrough in human history was born long before the invention itself. It was born inside curiosity. Curiosity is the engine behind every meaningful advance. The moment curiosity disappears, progress slows. The moment questioning becomes dangerous, creativity begins to fade. The moment people believe all essential answers already exist, discovery quietly ends. That is why the most valuable skill any generation can cultivate is not memorization. It is intelligent observation. Because observation gives birth to questions. Questions give birth to experiments. Experiments give birth to understanding. Understanding gives birth to entirely new possibilities. This cycle never ends. Unless we choose to end it ourselves. The next frontier. Perhaps the greatest mistake is believing that the future will be built simply by possessing newer tools. The future is always built by newer ways of seeing. Every generation inherits two legacies. One is knowledge. The other is the courage to go beyond it. Knowledge without courage becomes repetition. Courage without wisdom becomes chaos. The art of transformation lies in holding both. To honor what has been discovered, while remaining humble enough to admit that reality still contains countless mysteries waiting to be explored. And this leads us to an even deeper question. If borrowed beliefs, inherited certainty, and outdated perception shape the world we experience, then what, exactly, shapes the mind that holds those beliefs? Where do our deepest assumptions come from? Most people spend an entire lifetime without investigating that question. Yet hidden inside it lies the doorway to genuine freedom. And that doorway opens in the next chapter. Chapter 5. The Young Face and the Ancient Mind. Not every prison has walls. Some are built from habits so old that we no longer recognize them as cages. They become common sense. They become tradition. They become the way things have always been. And perhaps the strongest prison of all is the one that convinces you that change is dangerous while standing perfectly still is wisdom. At first glance, this belief feels comforting. After all, certainty promises safety. Familiarity promises stability. Predictability promises peace. Yet life itself refuses every one of those promises. Because life is movement. The universe has never stood still, not for a single heartbeat. Every star is traveling. Every forest is changing. Every river is rewriting its own path. Every cell inside your body is quietly replacing itself. Only the human mind insists on pretending that yesterday can be permanently preserved. And that is where the conflict begins. Not between the past and the future, but between life itself and the mind that refuses to move with it. The physician who waited. Several years ago, I visited the home of an accomplished physician. He had spent decades studying the human body. He understood biology. He trusted evidence. His professional life was built upon observation and reason. One evening, we prepared to leave for an important gathering. Just as we reached the door, a family member sneezed. The physician immediately stopped. "Let's wait for a minute," he said calmly. I looked at him in surprise. "You know exactly why people sneeze," I replied. "You understand the physiology better than most people on Earth. What possible connection exists between someone sneezing and our journey?" He smiled awkwardly. "I know it means nothing," he admitted. "But waiting doesn't hurt." At first, that answer sounds harmless. Perhaps even sensible. But hidden inside those few words lies one of the greatest obstacles to human growth. "I know. But just in case." Those 5 words have quietly delayed more progress than open ignorance ever has. Because ignorance asks questions. Half belief asks none. The physician possessed modern knowledge. Yet an older voice still whispered beneath it. A voice inherited long before evidence entered the conversation. The conflict was invisible. But it was real. And perhaps that same conflict exists inside all of us. How many decisions are guided by conclusions we no longer consciously believe, yet continue obeying anyway? That question deserves far more attention than it usually receives. The house built on 2 minds. Imagine constructing an extraordinary sailing vessel. The hull is engineered with the latest materials. The navigation systems are flawless. The sails are stronger than anything built before. Everything appears ready for a remarkable voyage. But below deck, hidden from view, sits an old captain who refuses to leave the harbor. Every time the crew raises the sails, he lowers them. Every time they set a new course, he redirects the ship toward familiar waters. No matter how advanced the vessel becomes, it never reaches the open sea. Many lives unfold exactly this way. People upgrade their tools, their education, their careers, their wardrobes, their devices, their resumes. But deep within, the same unquestioned assumptions continue steering every decision. The outside becomes modern. The inside remains ancient. Eventually, the tension becomes exhausting. Not because change is difficult. Because 2 versions of the same person are constantly pulling in opposite directions. One longs to explore. The other longs to repeat. And whichever voice wins shapes the future. The decoration against the storm. A successful designer once completed a remarkable building. Months of careful planning had gone into every detail. Every calculation was precise. Every measurement verified. Every structural element tested. The project represented years of education and experience. Just before opening day, however, the designer quietly attached a small decorative object near the entrance. Not because it served any engineering purpose. Not because it improved safety. But because someone had whispered, "It might prevent bad fortune." When asked why such a careful professional would rely on something unsupported by their own knowledge, the answer came quickly. "It probably changes nothing. But why take the risk?" Again, those familiar words. Why take the risk? Notice what happened. Reason had completed the building. Fear added the decoration. Knowledge designed the structure. Conditioning made the final decision. This is how inherited thinking survives. Rarely through force. Usually through tiny compromises. One harmless habit. One unquestioned ritual. One inherited assumption. Individually, they seem insignificant. Together, they quietly shape an entire worldview. Yet the deeper issue is not the decoration itself. It is the mind that no longer distinguishes between evidence and comfort. The difference between modern and new. There is another misunderstanding that deserves careful attention. Many people confuse novelty with transformation. They believe purchasing newer things automatically creates a newer life. But new objects do not guarantee new consciousness. Someone may hold the latest technology while clinging to centuries-old fears. Another may speak the language of innovation while making every important decision through inherited assumptions. Real renewal begins elsewhere. It begins inside perception. Modernity is not defined by appearance. It is defined by openness. An open mind remains willing to revise itself whenever reality reveals something deeper. A closed mind decorates itself with the symbols of progress while quietly resisting every genuine change. The difference cannot always be seen, but it can always be felt. One creates movement. The other creates imitation. The courage to leave the shore. Imagine standing beside an enormous ocean. Countless ships remain tied safely to the dock. Their owners polish them daily. Repair them. Admire them. Protect them from storms. Years pass. The ships remain beautiful. They never become sailors. Meanwhile, a smaller vessel quietly unties its ropes. It enters uncertain waters. Mistakes happen. Winds shift. Maps prove incomplete. The crew adapts. They learn. They return carrying discoveries no one else possesses. Life has always rewarded those willing to leave familiar harbors. Not because uncertainty is comfortable. Because possibility lives there. The future has never been built by people who merely protected yesterday. It has always been shaped by those courageous enough to ask, what has never been attempted before? That question has launched every meaningful adventure. Scientific, creative, personal, emotional, spiritual. Without it, progress becomes impossible. Youth is not an age. Society often measures youth by birthdays. Life measures it differently. Youth is not the absence of wrinkles. Youth is the presence of curiosity. A person can be 20 years old and already fear every unfamiliar idea. Another can be 80 and still wake each morning eager to learn something entirely new. One body grows older. The other spirit remains astonishingly alive. The truly young are not those who have lived fewer years. They are those who continue discovering. They climb mountains they have never seen. Read books that challenge their assumptions. Meet people unlike themselves. Experiment. Create. Question. Fail. Begin again. Each experience renews them. Because renewal has never been about age. It has always been about willingness. The willingness to remain unfinished. Every sunrise is original. Perhaps the greatest illusion we inherit is the belief that tomorrow will simply repeat yesterday. Look carefully. No sunrise has ever been duplicated. No snowfall has ever fallen in exactly the same pattern. No conversation has ever unfolded twice. Even as you read these words, your mind is changing. Neural pathways are shifting. Questions are emerging. Old assumptions are quietly loosening. The person who reaches the final page of this chapter is not quite the same person who began the first paragraph. That is the miracle of being alive. Life does not ask permission before it changes. It simply changes. The only question is whether we choose to change consciously with it, or unconsciously resist it. One path leads toward expansion. The other slowly transforms movement into memory. The door that opens forward. If the previous chapters have revealed anything, it is this. The greatest obstacle to transformation is rarely a lack of intelligence. It is the quiet loyalty we feel toward familiar thinking. We defend inherited beliefs. Repeat inherited explanations. Protect inherited identities. not because they are always true, but because they are familiar. Yet familiarity has never been proof of wisdom. Only repetition. And repetition, left unquestioned long enough, becomes invisible. That is why the next stage of our journey is not about collecting better ideas. It is about discovering the hidden mechanism that creates ideas in the first place. The mind itself. Because before we can transform our future, we must first understand the architecture of the consciousness that keeps rebuilding the past. That unseen architecture has been shaping your life since long before you realized it existed. And once you see it, you will never think in quite the same way again. Chapter 6. The Myth of the Golden Yesterday. There is a belief so deeply woven into the human mind that it often escapes examination. It whispers quietly, "The best days are already behind us." It sounds wise. It sounds humble. It even sounds comforting. Yet hidden inside that belief is a silent surrender. Because the moment you become convinced that greatness belongs only to yesterday, you unconsciously stop creating tomorrow. You no longer explore. You preserve. You no longer imagine. You remember. And slowly, almost invisibly, hope begins to shrink. Not because the future has become smaller, but because your vision has. This may be one of the greatest psychological traps humanity has ever created. And perhaps the most dangerous part is that it rarely feels like a trap. It feels like wisdom. The counsel of small possibilities. Imagine a colony of tiny woodland creatures living beneath the roots of an ancient forest. For generations they had gathered whenever danger appeared. Every challenge was discussed. Every meeting ended the same way. Someone would open an enormous collection of dusty scrolls. The oldest solutions were read aloud with great respect. One particular problem returned year after year. A silent hunter moved through the forest with extraordinary patience. Every generation proposed the same brilliant idea. If only the hunter could be heard before arriving, everyone would remain safe. The plan sounded perfect. Every meeting ended with applause. Then someone always asked the same question. But who will place the bell? Silence. The discussion ended. Nothing changed. The next generation repeated the same meeting. The same proposal. The same applause. The same impossible ending. Years became decades. Decades became centuries. Eventually everyone stopped believing change was possible. Not because the problem was unsolvable. Because imagination had become smaller than tradition. Then one season something unexpected happened. Two young explorers quietly disappeared for several days. They returned carrying no speeches. No theories. No philosophical arguments. Only a simple solution. Instead of endlessly debating the hunter's speed, they had discovered a way to make the hunter sleep. Once asleep, attaching the bell required only a few quiet moments. The impossible had never been impossible. It had only waited for a different question. The elders were stunned. Not because the solution was complicated. Because it had never occurred to them that a completely new approach was allowed. That is how genuine innovation usually arrives. Not through greater effort, but through greater freedom. The prison called impossible. There is a remarkable sentence the human mind loves repeating. It has never been done. Notice how quickly that sentence becomes evidence. As though history possesses authority over possibility. Every meaningful breakthrough began as something that had never been done. Every invention. Every discovery. Every artistic movement. Every scientific revolution. Every profound personal transformation. Before becoming reality, each one lived briefly inside the category called impossible. The impossible is often nothing more than possibility waiting for imagination. Yet inherited thinking rarely allows imagination enough room to breathe. It confuses unfamiliarity with impossibility. The difference is enormous. One invites exploration. The other ends it before it begins. And that difference quietly determines the future of every individual and every civilization. When the future becomes the enemy, there is another invisible habit that deserves attention. Many people fear the future not because they know what it contains, but because they do not. Uncertainty feels uncomfortable. The past, regardless of its imperfections, feels predictable. So the mind performs an extraordinary trick. It paints yesterday with brighter colors than yesterday ever possessed. Memories become polished. Difficulties fade. Exceptions become symbols. Ordinary moments transform into legends. Slowly an entire imaginary paradise is constructed behind us. Then something curious happens. Once the past becomes perfect, the future automatically appears disappointing. Hope quietly changes direction. Instead of looking forward, it begins looking backward. The imagination, which was designed to build tomorrow, becomes a museum curator. It carefully dusts old memories while neglecting the unfinished masterpiece waiting ahead. But the universe has never moved backward. Every sunrise arrives from the horizon ahead, never from the one behind. The illusion of perfect eras. Suppose archaeologists thousands of years from now uncover only the greatest achievements of our own time. They discover extraordinary works of art, groundbreaking scientific discoveries, beautiful music, powerful literature, acts of astonishing courage. That may be all history preserves. The ordinary conversations disappear. The daily fears vanish. The mistakes are forgotten. Future generations might conclude that everyone alive today possessed extraordinary wisdom. They would be mistaken. History has a peculiar habit. It preserves peaks. It quietly erases valleys. What survives is rarely average. It is exceptional. This creates a dangerous illusion. Every generation begins comparing itself with the greatest achievements of earlier generations rather than with the ordinary reality that surrounded them. It is an impossible comparison. Imagine judging an entire forest by only its tallest tree. The conclusion would never resemble reality. Yet we repeatedly evaluate history exactly that way. We compare today's average with yesterday's masterpiece. No wonder the present always appears inadequate. The comparison itself is distorted. The bright star effect. Walk outside on a clear night. Thousands of stars fill the sky. Yet your eyes immediately notice only the brightest. Not because the smaller stars do not exist. Because brilliance naturally draws attention. Human memory works in much the same way. It remembers extraordinary moments. It quietly forgets countless ordinary ones. This selective memory shapes how entire cultures understand the past. The brightest examples remain visible across centuries. Everything surrounding them gradually disappears. Eventually, people begin believing that an entire age was extraordinary. In reality, only a few rare lights continued shining across time. That realization changes everything. Greatness was never the average condition. It was always the courageous exception. And exceptions are invitations. Not evidence that everything once used to be better. The direction of hope. Perhaps the most important question is not whether earlier generations possessed wisdom. Many certainly did. The real question is this: where should hope lie? Behind us? Or ahead of us? A traveler who constantly walks while facing backward eventually loses the path. Not because the path vanished. Because attention did. The future asks something very different from us. It does not ask for worship. It asks for participation. Every child born into this world arrives carrying possibilities that have never existed before. Every conversation has the potential to produce an idea no mind has previously imagined. Every unanswered question hides discoveries still waiting to emerge. The universe is astonishingly creative. Why should humanity imagine creativity has already finished its work? The living river. Picture two travelers standing beside a river. One fills a glass bottle with water and proudly announces, "This is the river." The other smiles. "No," they reply. "That was the river." Even while the bottle was being filled, the river continued moving. Truth behaves the same way. Understanding expands. Knowledge evolves. Life keeps flowing. The moment we imprison living reality inside fixed conclusions, we stop drinking from the river itself. We begin protecting bottles. Bottles have value, but they must never replace the source. That distinction may become one of the most important discoveries of this entire journey. Because the purpose of wisdom has never been preserving yesterday's water. Its purpose is learning how to drink from the living stream. Again. And again. And again. Beyond memory. If these chapters have revealed one consistent pattern, it is this. Transformation does not begin by collecting better answers. It begins by releasing invisible assumptions. One of the deepest assumptions is that greatness belongs behind us. But what if the opposite is true? What if the greatest discoveries have not yet been made? What if the deepest understanding is still unfolding? What if your own life has not reached its most meaningful chapter? The answer cannot be borrowed from history. It must be created. Because every generation receives the same invitation. Not to become caretakers of yesterday, but architects of tomorrow. And yet there remains one final illusion, perhaps the oldest of them all. It is the illusion that certainty is safer than curiosity. Until that illusion dissolves, the doorway to genuine freedom remains only partially open. And that doorway is where our journey now leads. Chapter 7. The Courage to Build Tomorrow. Every civilization eventually arrives at a single defining question. Not a political question. Not an economic question. Not even a technological one. A deeper question. Do we exist to preserve what has been, or to create what has never been? Everything depends on how that question is answered. Because the future is never inherited. It is constructed. One decision. One insight. One act of courage at a time. Yet before any new world can be built, another illusion must quietly disappear. The illusion that greatness belongs to yesterday alone. That illusion has stolen more dreams than failure ever has. The mountain behind us. Imagine two travelers climbing through an endless range of mountains. The first traveler never stops looking over his shoulder. He keeps pointing toward the peak already crossed. That, he says, was the highest mountain that will ever exist. Every step forward feels disappointing because it is measured against memory. The second traveler looks toward the horizon. She admires the mountain behind her. She even feels gratitude for it. But her attention remains fixed on the peak still hidden inside the clouds. To her, every summit is preparation for another. One traveler carries history. The other carries possibility. Which one do you think discovers new landscapes? Life has already answered that question. The universe never repeats its greatest creation. It continues creating. Every dawn is evidence. Every newborn child is evidence. Every original idea is evidence. Existence itself has chosen evolution over repetition. Why should we choose differently? The brightest stars. There is another misunderstanding that quietly shapes how we see history. Human memory has always been selective. Walk into a vast forest and notice what your eyes remember. Not every leaf. Not every branch. Only the tallest trees. History behaves exactly the same way. Time quietly forgets millions of ordinary lives. It remembers only rare moments of extraordinary courage, unusual creativity, or profound wisdom. Centuries later, people look back and imagine that an entire era must have been extraordinary. But the surviving stories are not the average. They are the exception. Imagine someone thousands of years from now discovering only humanity's greatest inventions, greatest paintings, greatest acts of compassion, and greatest scientific breakthroughs. Would they conclude that every person living today possessed extraordinary wisdom? Of course not. They would simply be seeing the brightest stars while missing the ordinary night sky surrounding them. This is how memory creates myths. Not intentionally. Naturally. And myths become dangerous only when they convince us that excellence once existed everywhere but can never exist again. Nothing could be further from the truth. Greatness has never belonged to an era. It has always belonged to individuals courageous enough to rise beyond the ordinary. That possibility has never disappeared. It merely changes its clothing with each generation. The future is not waiting. Many people imagine the future as something that simply arrives. It does not. Tomorrow is built by what we choose today. Every bridge begins as imagination. Every discovery begins as curiosity. Every peaceful society begins with millions of daily decisions made by ordinary people. Nothing meaningful appears by accident. Left alone, gardens become wilderness. Buildings slowly decay. Muscles weaken. Skills disappear. Relationships grow distant. Life naturally drifts toward disorder unless conscious energy moves in the opposite direction. This is one of the most fundamental principles of existence. Creation requires participation. Decline requires only neglect. Think of a violin resting silently inside a room. Without practice, music does not slowly improve. Without care, the instrument quietly loses its voice. Human potential follows exactly the same law. Growth asks something from us. Decay asks nothing. That realization carries enormous responsibility. But it also carries extraordinary hope. Because if decline is created through unconscious living, renewal can be created through conscious living. The gravity of comfort. Every mountain climber understands something the valley rarely notices. Going downward happens almost effortlessly. Going upward demands intention. The same principle governs the inner world. It is remarkably easy to drift, to postpone, to repeat, to remain comfortably familiar. Growth asks for something different. Attention, discipline, curiosity, courage. Not because life wishes to punish us. Because every meaningful elevation requires energy. The universe does not resist our growth. It simply refuses to carry us there without our participation. Imagine planting an orchard. Would anyone expect fruit the following morning? Of course not. Daily care eventually becomes abundance. The invisible work always comes before the visible harvest. Yet our culture often hopes for transformation without transformation's process. We desire confidence without uncertainty, mastery without practice, peace without self-observation, purpose without exploration. Life has never worked that way. Nor should it. The journey shapes the traveler. Without the climb, the summit loses its meaning. Beyond borrowed authority. Perhaps the greatest misunderstanding of all is believing that wisdom can simply be transferred from one mind into another. Knowledge can be shared. Experience can be described. Stories can inspire. But seeing must always become your own. Throughout this book we have questioned inherited beliefs, old explanations, ready-made answers. Now another illusion must quietly fall. The belief that someone else can permanently think on our behalf. No voice, no matter how respected, should replace your own capacity to observe reality. The purpose of every genuine teacher is not to create followers. It is to awaken independent minds. The healthiest guide never asks for dependence. They quietly point toward the horizon and then encourage you to continue walking alone. Because truth borrowed from another person remains borrowed. Truth discovered through direct experience becomes part of your own consciousness. Only that kind of truth transforms. Everything else remains information. The workshop of awake minds. Imagine an enormous workshop unlike any ever built. There are no statues. No elevated chairs. No perfect blueprints hanging permanently on the walls. Instead, every person carries tools. Questions fill the room. Ideas collide. Experiments succeed. Experiments fail. Failure is not treated as embarrassment. It is treated as research. No one claims final certainty. Everyone remains curious. This workshop never closes because reality never stops unfolding. That is what a living society resembles. Not a museum protecting finished answers. A workshop producing living understanding. The greatest resource any civilization can cultivate is not obedience. It is awakened intelligence. A million thoughtful minds will always discover more than a handful of unquestioned authorities. Because reality is too vast to be explored by only a few. The future asks participation from everyone. The freedom to question. There is one request this book has never made. It has never asked you to believe it. Belief alone changes very little. Investigation changes everything. Accepting ideas simply because they sound beautiful would only create another invisible prison. Rejecting them without examination would do the same. Instead, carry every chapter into your own life. Observe. Experiment. Notice. Question. If an insight proves true through experience, it no longer belongs to these pages. It belongs to you. And once truth becomes your own experience, no authority is needed to defend it. Direct understanding stands quietly on its own. That is genuine freedom. Not freedom from questions. Freedom to keep asking them. The living flame. As our journey through these chapters comes to a pause, one image continues to return. Not an ancient monument. Not a crumbling building. Not a forgotten road. A flame. A living flame. Unlike stone, fire survives only through continual renewal. The moment it stops receiving fresh energy, it disappears. Human consciousness is much the same. Curiosity is its oxygen. Courage is its fuel. Awareness is its light. The moment we stop learning, the flame grows smaller. The moment we begin questioning again, it brightens. Perhaps that has been the hidden message beneath every story in this book. The old sanctuary, the familiar fragrance, the borrowed answers, the invisible prison of habit, the imagined perfection of the past, the fear of the unknown. Each chapter has pointed toward the same quiet invitation. Remain alive. Not merely breathing. Not merely existing. Remain inwardly alive. Because life does not belong to those who perfectly preserve yesterday. It belongs to those who are brave enough to participate in the endless creation of tomorrow. And perhaps the most beautiful discovery of all is this. The future is not a place you are traveling toward. It is something your consciousness begins creating the moment you decide to see with your own eyes. That decision may become the beginning of an entirely new life. Or perhaps, more accurately, the beginning of the life that has been waiting for you all along. Epilogue. If this book has done its work well, you are not the same person who opened its first page. Perhaps the change feels small, almost invisible. A question that refuses to leave your mind. A belief that no longer feels as certain. A possibility you had never considered before. Transformation rarely arrives like thunder. More often, it begins like sunrise. Quietly. Patiently. Without asking for permission. Long before the world notices. The light has already begun to change. Throughout these pages, We have walked together through abandoned structures that refused to fall. We uncovered invisible habits that quietly shaped entire lives. We questioned borrowed answers. We challenged inherited certainty. We explored why familiar suffering often feels safer than unfamiliar freedom. And perhaps most importantly, we discovered that the greatest prison is rarely built by other people. It is built by unquestioned assumptions. Every chapter pointed toward the same simple truth. Life is not asking you to become someone else. It is asking you to stop living as someone you no longer are. The walls were never your identity. They were only your surroundings. The stories were never your essence. They were only your inheritance. The fears were never your destiny. They were only your habits. That distinction changes everything. Because habits can change. Stories can be rewritten. Walls can be dismantled. And awareness changes the architecture of an entire life. Yet there is something even more important to understand. This book was never meant to become another collection of ideas stored on a shelf. It was never meant to become another voice inside your head telling you what to believe. If that happened, this book would simply become another invisible prison. Instead, close these pages. Walk outside. Watch how your mind reacts when something unexpected happens. Notice how quickly old explanations appear. Notice how often fear disguises itself as certainty. Notice how many decisions are made automatically. Not to judge yourself. Simply to observe. Because observation is where freedom begins. The moment you become aware of a pattern, you are no longer completely controlled by it. That is the first crack in every invisible wall. And once light enters through a single crack, the entire room slowly changes. Do not rush this process. A forest does not grow overnight. A river does not carve a canyon in one afternoon. Even stars spend millions of years becoming bright enough to illuminate distant worlds. Growth has never been a race. It is a relationship. A relationship between curiosity and patience. Between courage and humility. Between action and reflection. Some mornings you will feel deeply awake. Other mornings old habits will quietly return. That is not failure. That is what being human looks like. The goal has never been perfection. The goal has always been consciousness. To notice. To learn. To begin again. Again. And again. Remember the abandoned sanctuary from the beginning of our journey. It was never only a building. It was every outdated belief that continued occupying valuable space inside the mind. Remember the traveler who confused familiarity with truth. The workshop where old tools could no longer solve new problems. The invisible masks. The imagined golden past. None of those stories were about someone else. They were mirrors, not windows. If you recognize yourself within them, that recognition was not meant to create guilt. It was meant to create possibility. Because every honest realization becomes the birthplace of freedom. There is one final truth I hope you carry long after these words fade. The universe is not finished creating. Neither are you. Every sunrise arrives carrying possibilities that have never existed before. Every meaningful conversation has the power to alter a lifetime. Every thoughtful question expands the boundaries of human understanding. Every act of courage makes tomorrow slightly different from today. You do not need permission to become new. Life has already given it. You do not need certainty before taking the next step. No explorer in history ever had it. You do not need to know the entire path. You only need enough light for the next step. The path reveals itself to those who keep walking. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson hidden beneath every page of this book. Freedom is not a destination waiting somewhere in the future. It is a way of seeing. A way of questioning. A way of participating in the endless unfolding of life. The moment you begin seeing with your own eyes, listening with your own awareness, thinking with your own intelligence, living with your own courage, The invisible prison begins to disappear. Not all at once, but steadily, quietly, irreversibly. So as this journey comes to an end, I will not ask you to remember these chapters. I will ask for something far more valuable. Forget the words if you must. But never lose the curiosity they awakened. Because curiosity is the doorway through which every meaningful transformation enters. And if one day, months or years from now, you suddenly notice yourself responding differently to life, choosing awareness over habit, discovery over certainty, creation over repetition, the future over nostalgia, then you will know something extraordinary happened here. Not because this book changed you, but because it reminded you of a truth that was quietly waiting within you all along. This may be the final page. But if you have truly seen what these chapters were pointing toward, then this is not an ending. It is the first page of the unwritten book that only you can create. And no one, not history, not habit, not fear, not tradition, can write that story for you. Only you can. The page is blank. The pen is already in your hand.